the October 7th Hamas massacres, the ongoing Gaza-Israel war, and today, the war behind the war. Welcome, everyone, for another episode of Israel Under Fire. The October 7th Hamas massacres, the ongoing Gaza-Israel war, and today, the war behind the war. And there is no one better to talk about the Iranian regime than one of the great experts and an old friend and colleague, Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, major expert at FDD Center on Economic and Financial Power, and the author of the Pasdaran, another word for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, inside Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran. Emanuele, it is great to have you on Israel Under Fire. We have a lot to talk about because there is an Iranian octopus whose tentacles are attempting to strangle Israel on all of its borders, and October 7th was just the latest attempt to completely squeeze the air out of Israel's Jewish and Muslim and Christian citizens. Mass murder, mass kidnapping. We haven't seen anything like it since the Nazi period, and it is just an extension of the Iranian Pasdaran strategy beginning back in 1979.
Pleasure to be here, Dan. Thank you for hosting me.
Thanks for being with us.
The Iranian strategy has a distinctive feature, which is the use of proxies. And of course, the proxies fulfill several functions. The first is the core function of Iran's aspiration to export its revolution and its ideals and political model. Hezbollah is, of course, the most successful and entrenched of these experiments, the one that Iran started with back in 1981, and which today controls essentially Lebanon. I mean, it is physically present and in control of the south, but it has penetrated all aspects and levels of power and society in Lebanon. And from there, of course, Hezbollah spread as well into Syria during the civil war. They're becoming a key player on behalf of Iran and doing Iran's bidding both in Syria to save the Assad regime and on the Golan Heights to open another front against Israel. But Hezbollah has also been deployed in Iraq and then in Yemen to export its model to other regional militias, all of which form part, of course, of the strategy. And as we all know, although Hamas was established independently of Hezbollah and indeed Iran, it has fallen into its orbit, and there is a high degree of coordination, information sharing, and mutual learning. What we've seen on October 7, of course, is a taste of what Iran wants to inflict on Israel, and it will do so by continuing to a large extent to use proxies, which give Iran some distance from their actions, plausible deniability in some cases. And we see that this is the way Iran also behaves when it carries out actions and operations abroad. Sometimes it does rely on its own agents or indeed its own embassies, but it also relies on agents of Hezbollah mainly. In recent times, we actually have also seen them contracting operations to members of organized crime syndicates. So there's always an attempt to be one or two steps removed from the actions. But the actions are designed to, of course, cause maximum damage. And they're also designed not to seek a direct conventional military confrontation with its own enemies. They're meant to seek and pursue a model of hybrid warfare designed to undermine and break societies and public opinion in the process.
There is a misconception in many places in the West, Europe and the United States, that Hezbollah works independently according to Hassan Nasrallah's instructions, and Yahya Sinwar works independently. And in fact, while the October 7th massacre indicates that Hamas apparently acted prematurely because there was a plan, as we understand, that was hatched by Iran for a multi-front simultaneous assault on Israel in the first major proxy attempt to destroy Israel from the north and from the south, that in fact Hamas and Hezbollah for sure take their instructions and receive their salary slips from Tehran.
Hezbollah was created by Iran, and it is an extension of its Revolutionary Guards. It is controlled by Iran, and it embraces the fundamental religious ideological tenets of the Islamic Republic, the idea that the supreme leader is, the infallible guide to which they have to respond. Ideologically as well as organizationally, there is an integrated structure between Iran and Hezbollah that of course goes all the way to the absolute dependency of Hezbollah on Iran for weapon supplies, for financial support, and increasingly that's become the case with Hamas. And yes, they therefore are entirely dependent and coordinated into a larger plan.
We have seen in the past years, especially since 2018, when you and I remember there was something called the Great March of Return that featured pictures in Gaza of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, all at the behest of the Hamas Iranian leadership to essentially foster a disinformation campaign with their Iranian financing, sent children charging towards the fence to draw the fire of the Israeli Defense Forces and then get paid for sacrificing themselves as martyrs. So when you think of the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood, the pathway to the Al-Aqsa flood was paved, if you may, or a better metaphor might be the tidal wave towards the Al-Aqsa flood was already generated and powered years before by the Iranians. And you saw photographs of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and photographs of Qasem Soleimani until he was assassinated by the Americans in 2020. You used to see them all over Gaza.
Well beyond the confines of the Middle East, you see them in Venezuela, for example. You see them in other places around the world. The Iranians, style themselves as a sort of a beacon of revolutionary fervor and want to extend this axis of resistance far beyond the confines of the Middle East and the Islamic world. And so they're extremely good at marketing their ideology and their role in the world in a way that, where it's expedient, de-emphasizes the Islamic element and sort of brings to the fore the revolutionary, anti-imperialist, anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-West element. In Latin America, they compare Soleimani to Chavez, and when the Iranian president Ibrahim Raisi was on a tour of the region in June of last year, 2023, the posters that they were distributing to attendees of public events with him, such as students at universities, did not have the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and the president of Iran, Raisi, as the icons of the event, but they had Soleimani and Chavez. And they appropriated the icon of Che Guevara, of Julian Assange. Depends on the context, but essentially their message is, yes, we are an Islamic revolution, but focus on revolution. We are a revolutionary movement. Our resistance battle is your resistance battle. And by doing so, they have managed to accomplish essentially what the PLO did in the 60s and 70s. They have transformed their war against Israel into a global struggle for revolutionary justice, to which disparate political movements and allies can relate to.
When we come back, Emanuele Ottolenghi telling us the inside story of the Iranian regime and Latin America, a long and bloody narrative. And we're back. Dan Diker, Israel Under Fire. Delighted to have with us today Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi, one of the world's great experts on the Iranian regime and a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. We started to talk about Iran's long tentacles into Latin America, and we know they have been squeezing and strangling Latin America for many years and executing bloody terror atrocities. We remember the Jewish Community Center in Argentina, tragedy back in 1994, and even before that, the Israeli embassy in Argentina bombed, both of them, both times bombed by the IRGC. But the tentacles of the Iranian regime and the export of the Iranian Revolution or the Islamic Revolution in Iran goes way beyond Argentina, in fact.
Absolutely. Iran pursues a three-pronged strategy in Latin America, and indeed it's the same strategy they use elsewhere. The first, of course, is the kind of formal, open, visible, state-to-state, government-to-government that involves diplomacy, embassies, delegations, commercial relations, and of course Iran pursues that more vigorously where it finds ideological fellow travelers. The case of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, of course, stand out in that part of the world. The second, of course, is a soft power approach that leverages entry points wherever they may be to establish cultural centers, Islamic centers, mosques, media platforms, publications, cooperations with universities, you name it, which allow for them to establish a vanguard of supporters. And I emphasize the word here because Iran, as well as Hezbollah, essentially embrace a kind of a Leninist model of operation in the way they structure their political organizations and the way they promote their ideas. They don't want millions to sort of join the fight. They want an elite, a spearhead of devoted ideologues to be their messengers. And that's what they do in Latin America. They've been very successful. They started out in Argentina in 1982 by sending Mohsen Rabbani as an envoy. He was later implicated in the Amia bombing that you referred to. But today, Iran has more than 80 Islamic centers in Latin America. It has established a department of geopolitical studies in a university in Venezuela. It has a scientific cooperation agreement with a couple of other universities, one in Bolivia, one in Argentina. It has a coordination on virtual webinar platforms with numerous departments across the region. It has itinerant missionaries that convert Latin Americans. It has a program to bring them back to Iran and indoctrinate them. And little by little, slowly, it's building up this network of support. And that is, of course, helped and propped up by, as I said, media platforms. Many of your viewers may know about Ispan TV, which the Iranian regime established in 2012. It's a continent-wide television and streaming platform in Spanish 24/7, full of different content. That is essentially a mouthpiece of the regime, but that it also has smaller operations across the region that are run by its own cadre of converts and ideologues. So that's the second prong. The third prong, of course, is Hezbollah.
Why are the Latin American countries refusing to corner and isolate Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela, which has basically become an extension of the Iranian regime in Latin America. I think this episode should be called Latin America Under Fire, America Under Fire, and the Iranian regime outside America's back door.
Obviously, we're talking about a vast region with more than 30 countries there. Some are obviously more vociferously opposed to what is happening in Venezuela. One of the problems you have in Latin America is that there is a tradition of non-intervention in internal affairs, sticking to what the UN says and not going beyond it. And there isn't much courage, let alone the means to actually be able to isolate Maduro. There's also very little cooperation between states on all levels. They tend to be inclined to and dependent on relations with the United States. And I think the biggest problem we're confronting today when it comes to what is happening in Venezuela, as well as the presence of Iran in the region, is the lack of leadership from Washington in showing the way.
In our third segment, we're going to talk about U.S. leadership in the war on the Iranian regime, what has gone wrong in Washington, and what could go right. Stay with us. Welcome back to Israel Under Fire. I'm Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and I'm joined by a longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi, one of the great experts on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Iranian regime. We left our last segment talking about leadership, Emanuele. What kind of moral clarity and strategic clarity does Washington require in order to take on a regime that it seems that Washington has believed, certainly since the Obama administration, that the Iranian regime is the solution opposite Salafi Sunni terrorism like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as opposed to the problem? What's required from Washington? What's gone wrong and what needs to go right?
We see, of course, heightened activity by Iran in the region, and we also see authoritarian allies of Iran in the region openly defying the U.S. And what we're not seeing is the kind of moral clarity you're referring to. We're not seeing effective pushback. We have seen, for example, just as recently as November, the revelation of a terrorist plot by Hezbollah in Brazil, and reluctance at the public level to take the kind of actions that we would expect of the U.S. government. Sanctions, countermeasures, public condemnation, perhaps indictments taking place. We have seen, of course, much more concerning developments. Last year, the deployment of Iranian warship in Latin America, making port calls with very little pushback and no consequences for the governments, countries, and officials who made those visits possible. We are seeing the Venezuelan dictator reneging on commitments he made to the United States in exchange for the suspension of sanctions back in October, with him, rounding up members of the opposition, disqualifying the leading candidate of the opposition and her replacement, and very little consequence so far, a veiled threat of reimposing sanctions in the middle of April that now appears to be even being walked back. So all across the board, the signals that authoritarians are getting are no pushback, and the countries on the fence take stock of that. Countries that may have some sympathy with the dictators, even though they don't fully share their worldview or political model, are also taking stock of that. And generally speaking, what you're seeing is a region that is trying to hedge its bets given the eclipse of American power they are experiencing. They're playing footsie with China, playing footsie with other authoritarian regimes, because essentially at the end of the day, they need to survive, and if they no longer can depend on an American umbrella, they'll go elsewhere.
If we go back 1 year to March 2023, the Iranian regime drove a dagger through the heart of American foreign policy and influence in the Middle East by engaging the Chinese to mediate we would call it diplomatic re-engagement between the Iranian regime and the Saudis. Now, it's clear that the Saudis dislike the Iranian regime as much today as they did before. And we know that China, in the eyes of the United States government and the former government, have become really a main adversary of U.S. interests. And here you have the Chinese mediating a deal between what the Iranians consider to be their archenemy, the United States, and the Saudis. Why, in your view, does the United States not understand that it's really being played by the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime, together with its Russian and Chinese, I don't know if they're allies or associates, have really redrawn the international map right now of global power?
Some people in Washington continue, and indeed in Europe, continue to live under the illusion that Iran is a competitor that we can do business with, that has a pragmatic approach to politics, even though it pursues different interests and a different model. They tend to discount a lot of elements which, in my view, are extremely influential in explaining and driving Iran's behavior, because they peel them off as irrelevant, and they focus exclusively on the fact that Iran is a nation state, and therefore it must be acting like one. They don't realize that Iran is very much like the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, a country that, yes, has its own national interest. Yes, it is a nation state. Yes, it has also concrete limits in the way it can use its resources to pursue its goals, but that still is driven by an ideological aspiration, and that trumps what we could consider, or we would call, the pragmatic or realistic drivers. By discounting these factors, we keep misunderstanding what Iran is about, and we keep misunderstanding what we need to do to confront Iran. What the United States, what Europe should be doing responding to Iran is what Israel did by going straight to an Iranian core interest when it targeted a building next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. We need to send a message that there is a cost to what Iran is doing in the region and elsewhere.
It's ironic that the United States was born out of revolution, but revolution for freedom and revolution from religious coercion. And here we've come full circle. And what we've learned from you is to keep our eyes on the revolution and to take religious fealty very seriously. Let me thank you, please, Emanuele Ottolenghi.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to seeing you very soon for another episode of Israel Under Fire.